Hey everyone, welcome to the Bold and Beautiful 24. I'm Alessio, and I'm so excited to have you here. If you love Bold and Beautiful, then you're in the right place. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. Alright, let's dive right in.
When the truth finally came out, the air inside Bill Spencer's living room felt like it had been stripped of oxygen, leaving only tension, silence, and the sound of hearts breaking beneath the weight of something no one had been prepared to face. For Will Spencer, who had grown up always feeling like the world was measured and logical, or at least that his father would always make sense of the chaos, the words hit him like a gunshot. Will, you're the father of Luna's baby. Bridget's voice was calm but laced with the kind of careful precision doctors use when they know what they're saying will detonate a life. For a few seconds, Will didn't blink, didn't breathe, didn't even understand the meaning of the sentence. He just stared straight ahead, like someone had ripped the world out from under him and replaced it with noise he couldn't process. He'd gone into that room believing there was no way, no chance, no universe in which he was about to be handed that kind of responsibility, that kind of lifetime-altering news. But now, everything around him was moving. Bill stepping forward, Ridge shouting, Luna shaking, Bridget looking down at the paper in her hands. And Will just stood there, still. The ground wasn't steady anymore, and neither was he. The strange thing about moments like these is how quiet they are. There wasn't some dramatic music playing like in the movies. No grand speech. No comforting words. Just this stunned silence that wrapped itself around him so tightly it felt suffocating. And then, like water spilling out of a cracked glass, emotions began to flood through him. Confusion first, then denial, then a kind of cold dread that sank into his stomach and wouldn't leave. He didn't remember walking out of the room. He didn't remember pushing past his father, or the way Luna's voice cracked when she tried to call his name. All he knew was that 1 second he was standing there, and the next he was outside in the night air, his hands trembling so badly he could barely pull his phone from his pocket. He wanted to call someone, anyone. But who do you call when your entire future just collapsed in a single sentence? He was too young, too unprepared, too shocked. This wasn't supposed to happen to him. Not like this. Not with Luna. His mind wouldn't stop replaying it. Her face. Her tears. The way she looked when she realized the test confirmed what she'd secretly feared. He didn't hate her, not exactly. But he couldn't forgive her either. Everything about their brief, reckless, complicated connection now felt like a trap. She'd said she wasn't sure. She'd said there were other possibilities, and Will, naive, wanting to believe in control, had clung to the hope that it wouldn't be him. He'd convinced himself she wasn't pregnant at all, or that if she was, it belonged to someone else. Maybe that was selfish. Maybe that was denial. But when you're young and scared, sometimes the truth isn't something you prepare for. It's something that hits you and knocks all the air out of your chest. He could still feel the way his heart had pounded against his ribs, so loud it drowned everything else out. Inside the house, people were arguing, Ridge blaming Luna, Bill defending his son, Bridget trying to calm everyone down, and Luna herself crying uncontrollably. But none of it reached Will in any real way. The only sound he truly heard was his own breathing, uneven and sharp, and the sound of his own thoughts tearing him apart. He thought about his father and the expectations that came with being a Spencer, about the public image, about the judgment, about the press, about how in a matter of hours he would no longer just be Will, the youngest Spencer, the quiet, smart kid with a bright future. No, now he'd be Will Spencer, the father of Luna Nozawa's unborn child. It wasn't just a headline. It was a life sentence. He thought about Luna's eyes, wide, scared, guilty. She hadn't wanted this either. But the difference was she was already inside the storm. And now he'd been pulled in too, whether he liked it or not. It's strange how fear can turn into something else so quickly. For Will, it turned into numbness. A kind of cold, hollow quiet where nothing felt real anymore. He sat in his car for a long time, just staring at the steering wheel, his phone buzzing over and over with calls he couldn't answer. His father, Luna, Bridget, probably even Ridge trying to get ahead of the scandal. He didn't pick up. He couldn't. Because if he did, then it would make everything real, and right now, reality was the last thing he wanted to face. It wasn't that he didn't know how serious this was. He knew all too well. It was that he didn't know how to live inside a reality where this was his life now. He was young, still figuring himself out. He wasn't ready to be a father. He wasn't ready for the world to change like this. By the time he got home, the numbness had settled deep in his bones, and everything he touched felt distant, muted, like the world was happening behind a wall of glass. He went up to his room and sat on the edge of the bed, his hands buried in his hair, his breathing uneven. It wasn't a loud breakdown. It wasn't screaming or punching walls. It was quieter than that, more dangerous. It was a quiet collapse, a moment where the weight of everything became so heavy he didn't know how to hold it anymore. He didn't know how to be Will Spencer, the person everyone expected him to be, while also being this terrified kid whose life had just been rerouted without his consent. And then, in a moment that he wouldn't be able to fully explain later, his eyes landed on the small bottle sitting on his nightstand. The sleeping pills, prescribed weeks earlier after a brutal bout of insomnia. Back then, it had been harmless. Now they looked like an escape. The thought didn't come like a scream. It came like a whisper. Just sleep. Just make it stop. He told himself he wasn't thinking about dying. He told himself he just wanted the noise to go away. Just wanted to stop feeling this overwhelming storm inside him for one night. One night where the world didn't exist. His hands moved almost automatically, unscrewing the cap, shaking the pills into his palm. The white capsules felt cold against his skin. He didn't count how many there were. He didn't think about the consequences. He just swallowed. One. Then another. And another. The bitterness burned his throat, and a single tear slid down his face. Not from pain, but from the quiet surrender that came with finally giving up fighting a battle he didn't even understand. What Will didn't know was that at that exact same moment, Bill was downstairs pacing like a man who'd just realized he was losing his son not to distance or rebellion, but to something much darker, despair. He'd seen that look in Will's eyes before he walked out. That hollow, distant stare. And as much as Bill wanted to believe his son was strong, he also knew how fragile pain can make a person. He called him over and over, his voice growing sharper with every unanswered ring. It wasn't just worry now. It was panic. He'd lost people before. He knew the signs. He wasn't going to lose Will. Not like this. When he finally decided to drive to Will's place, his hands were shaking on the steering wheel. Upstairs, Will's breathing slowed, the room blurring around him, his body heavier than it should have been. He wasn't dying. Not yet. But his mind was slipping further away from everything that had anchored him to the world. The phone on his desk buzzed again, the sound muffled and distant, like it belonged to someone else's life. He thought of Luna then, not as the girl who ruined everything, but as the girl who had cried when she realized their lives were tied together forever. He thought of his father, stubborn, infuriating, but always there. He thought of the way everything had changed in a single moment. And he closed his eyes. Bill's voice was the first thing that cut through the haze. He didn't remember how his father got inside. He didn't remember the door opening, or the sound of his father shouting his name. He just felt hands shaking him, a cold rush of air hitting his face, and Bill's voice, panicked, rough, trembling, begging him to open his eyes. The world came back in fragments. Sirens. Lights. Bridget's face. A paramedic shouting numbers. A stretcher. The ceiling rushing past him as he was carried down the stairs. Will wanted to say he was sorry. That he didn't mean for it to go this far. That he just wanted to stop feeling like he was drowning. But his mouth wouldn't form the words. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and cold air. Will woke up hours later in a dimly lit room, his throat dry, his head pounding, and an four-line running into his arm. Bill was sitting beside him, his face pale and broken in a way Will had never seen before. Bill Spencer was supposed to be unshakable, the kind of man who didn't show weakness. But right then, he looked like a father who had just come terrifyingly close to losing the most important person in his life. Will opened his mouth, but Bill shook his head, his eyes glassy, his voice cracking as he whispered that it was okay. That he was safe. That he wasn't going anywhere. But Will didn't feel safe. He felt like someone who had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. And the weight of what he'd done hit him harder than the pregnancy news ever could. He hadn't just tried to run away from the truth. He'd almost run away from everyone who loved him. And that realization broke something inside him. For the first time since the test results, he cried. Not the quiet tears from earlier, but the real, raw kind of sobbing that tears through a person like a storm. Bill held him, and for once, Will didn't push him away. Because for the first time, he understood how close he'd come to disappearing from this world completely. The fallout came in waves. Luna showed up at the hospital the next day, pale, terrified, guilt etched all over her face. She wasn't just the girl who was pregnant anymore. She was someone who realized how her truth had nearly cost someone else their life. She tried to speak, but Will couldn't look at her at first. He wasn't ready to forgive her. Maybe he wouldn't be for a long time. But as the hours passed, as doctors checked on him, as his father sat silently by his side, Will realized that what happened wasn't just about Luna or the baby or his fear. It was about the way one piece of news can shatter a person who never learned how to carry something that heavy. This wasn't a story about blame anymore. It was a story about survival. About the quiet, messy, devastating ways life can change in a heartbeat. About how fear can push someone to the edge. And how love, stubborn and loud and unrelenting, can pull them back. Will wasn't okay. Not yet. But as he stared out the hospital window that night, listening to the steady beeping of the monitor beside him, he realized that he was still here. Still breathing. Still fighting. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. Luna came in one last time before leaving that night. She didn't say much. Just a quiet apology that hung in the air between them like smoke. Will didn't answer. But he didn't turn away either. And that, in its own fractured way, was the beginning of something neither of them knew how to define. Bill stood outside the room, hands buried in his pockets, looking like a man who'd aged 10 years in a single night. He didn't care about the scandal, or Ridge's outrage, or what anyone would say. All he cared about was that his son was alive, that he had another chance to fight for him. And so, as the lights dimmed and the hospital grew quieter, Will lay there with the weight of everything pressing against him, but also with the faintest flicker of something else in his chest. Not hope exactly, but something close to it. He didn't know what would happen with Luna. He didn't know how he'd handle becoming a father. He didn't even know if he was ready to forgive himself. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He wasn't going to run anymore. Not from the truth. Not from himself. Not from the life that, whether he liked it or not, was now his to face. Luna had never felt more powerless in her life. When she walked into that hospital room and saw Will lying there, pale against the sheets with N4 dripping slowly into his arm, something inside her shattered. She had imagined 100 versions of how the truth about her baby's father might come out. She'd prepared herself for screaming, accusations, even hatred. But never this. Never Will nearly slipping away from the world. Because the weight of their mistake was too heavy for him to carry. She'd spent most of the night in the hallway outside his room. Too scared to go in, too guilty to walk away. Her hands trembled constantly. Her throat ached from crying. And every time a nurse walked past, she flinched like she expected them to come tell her he was gone. The thing about Luna was that she was used to being seen as a problem. She'd been called reckless, manipulative, unstable. And maybe parts of that were true. She had made choices she couldn't undo. She'd lied. She'd run. She'd let chaos swirl around her like a storm. But none of that had prepared her for this. For being the reason someone so young, so alive, so kind in ways she'd never deserved, had wanted to disappear. Will's face haunted her. The blank, hollow look he'd had after Bridget read the results wasn't something she could ever forget. That wasn't anger. That wasn't disappointment. That was despair. And it terrified her. When Ridge arrived at the hospital, the hallway practically vibrated with his rage. His voice echoed, sharp and loud, cutting through the sterile quiet like a blade. He wasn't subtle. He didn't try to hide his disgust. "This is exactly what I said would happen," he growled at Bill. "This girl has done nothing but destroy lives. And now your son almost." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. The silence after it said everything. Ridge wasn't just angry at Luna. He was furious with Bill too, furious at the world, furious at a situation no one could control anymore. But underneath that fury was fear. The kind of fear only a parent knows. That sick, paralyzing terror of almost losing someone. Bill didn't snap back immediately, which surprised everyone. Usually Bill Spencer met fire with fire. But that night, his fire had burned out. All that was left in him was exhaustion, and a desperate kind of love. He looked older, like the weight of everything had carved new lines into his face overnight. "Ridge," he said quietly, his voice rough. "This isn't the time." He didn't need to explain himself. The look in his eyes said everything. He'd spent hours sitting next to Will's bed, holding his hand, begging his son to wake up. He'd been forced to face the brutal truth that for all his power, for all his wealth, he couldn't protect his boy from pain. Not this kind of pain. But Ridge, being Ridge, wasn't ready to let go of his anger. He looked at Luna like she was poison. "Do you even understand what you've done?" he hissed at her, his voice low and dangerous. "Do you have any idea what it's like to almost lose a child? You've dragged him into your mess and now—" Again he didn't finish. Maybe because deep down, even Ridge knew there was no undoing this. No speech, no punishment, no rage could rewind what had already happened. Luna didn't fight back. She didn't try to defend herself. She just stood there with tears streaking down her face, shaking her head like she could somehow undo the damage by refusing to believe it was real. But it was real. Terrifyingly, irreversibly real. Inside the room, Will opened his eyes again slowly. The world still felt a little blurry, but clearer than the night before. The faint hum of machines filled the air. It was oddly steady, almost comforting in its rhythm. He turned his head slightly and saw his father sitting beside him, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the floor like he'd been staring at the same spot for hours. Will tried to speak, but his throat burned. Bill looked up instantly, and the raw relief on his face was enough to make Will's chest tighten. His father, the man who always acted like nothing could touch him, looked utterly broken. "Hey," Bill whispered, leaning forward, gripping his son's hand like he was afraid to let go. "Hey buddy. You're here." Will wanted to say something, anything, but the words got stuck somewhere between shame and exhaustion. He didn't want to see the disappointment in his father's eyes. But what he saw wasn't disappointment. It was fear. And love. A kind of love that made it impossible to hide behind sarcasm or anger. "I'm sorry," Will finally croaked out, his voice cracking. "I didn't. I wanted to stop everything." Bill shook his head quickly, his voice shaking. "Don't you ever apologize for being in pain. You hear me? Don't you ever apologize for that. I should have seen it. I should have been there." That broke something inside Will. Because it wasn't his father's job to fix him, but Bill would have tried anyway. Outside the room, Luna pressed her back against the wall, listening to the muffled sound of voices through the door. She wanted to go in so badly. To tell Will she was sorry, to promise she'd do anything to fix this. But the truth was, she didn't even know if she deserved to see him. The world had turned on her fast. People whispered when she walked by. Ridge's glare followed her like a shadow. Even some of the nurses looked at her with quiet judgment. She knew what they were thinking. That's the girl who ruined his life. And maybe they weren't wrong. The guilt was a living thing inside her, growing heavier with every passing hour. Bill eventually stepped out to get some air. And that's when Luna finally gathered the courage to walk in. The room was quiet except for the soft beeping of the monitor and the rain tapping against the window. Will turned his head slowly when he heard the door creak open. Seeing her standing there was like being hit with every emotion at once. Anger, hurt, confusion, and something softer buried deep beneath it all. She looked terrified. Not of him, but of herself. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered. Her voice cracked, and it wasn't the smooth, confident tone she usually used to manipulate her way through situations. This was real. Broken. "But I needed to see you." Will didn't say anything at first. He just looked at her. And for the first time, Luna didn't look like the girl who'd cornered him into a situation he couldn't escape. She looked like someone who was scared too. Someone who had no idea how to fix what she'd done. "I never meant for any of this to happen," she said, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I swear to you, Will. I thought I could handle it. I thought maybe it wouldn't be you. I thought everything would work itself out somehow. But I was wrong. I was so wrong. And you almost..." Her voice broke before she could finish the sentence. She covered her mouth with her hand, choking on a sob. Will closed his eyes for a second. The pain in her voice hurt almost as much as the pain inside him. He didn't know how to forgive her. Maybe he wouldn't for a long time. But he also couldn't bring himself to hate her, not fully. Not when she looked at him like that. Luna, he whispered, his voice hoarse. You don't get it. It wasn't just the baby. It was everything. My dad. The press. My future. It all came crashing down in 1 second. And I didn't know how to breathe anymore. Luna nodded through her tears, whispering, I know. I know. I destroyed everything. But then Will said something that surprised even himself. You didn't destroy me. I almost did that myself. There was a long silence after that, the kind that isn't empty but heavy with everything left unsaid. Luna stepped closer to the bed, her hands shaking, and for the first time since the results, they just looked at each other without screaming, without accusations, without pretending. Just two scared, broken people caught in something bigger than either of them could control. Ridge eventually came back, still furious, still protective of everyone except Luna. He didn't like seeing her near Will, and his first instinct was to order her out. But Bill, standing behind him now, shook his head. Let him talk to her, Bill said quietly. He needs to face this his way. Ridge wanted to argue, but the look in Bill's eyes stopped him. This wasn't about the Forrester family or the Spencers, or even the scandal anymore. It was about a boy who had almost lost his life, and a girl who had never stopped running from the truth. Days turned into weeks, and Will remained in the hospital for observation. The incident wasn't swept under the rug. It exploded across Los Angeles like wildfire. Every outlet, every gossip column, every family gathering whispered the same thing. Will Spencer, the young heir, father of Luna Nozawa's baby, nearly overdosed on sleeping pills. It wasn't just a story. It was a reckoning. Bill had to face it publicly and privately. Ridge was relentless about Luna facing consequences. Brooke tried to calm the storm. Finn tried to stay neutral, but couldn't hide his disappointment. And Luna had to live with the weight of it every single day.